Good morning, dear colleagues. We can see some participants joining, but we can't be late. We are recording the webinar, so the colleagues would be able to see the beginning a bit later. Welcome to the third webinar on the corruption measurement, which was developed by the UNODC. So all of the member states would follow the UNCAC. My name is Azat Joldasovic. I'm the National Coordinator of the Corruption on the UNODC Regional Office. The webinar is held on the basis of the Central Asia platform on the fast-tracking of UNCAC. Last time we spoke about the measurement and evaluation of the situations related to the money laundering. We covered a lot of questions. We were not able to cover two more points on which we will dwell your attention today: the assessment and measurement of the illegal enrichment and also power abuse. Before we start, I would like to make an announcement, a small one, on the changes into the format of having the webinar. Before the theory, now we will have a Q&A session, actually the answer to some questions which we received from the colleagues. Also, we are more than happy to inform the participants, those who pass the test. Following the webinar will be issued a certificate of participation. Also, we are considering an option when every Friday from the second part of this year, such kind of events will become regular, and we will speak about the practice-oriented issues. For example, finding, detecting, tracking the assets which were stolen as a result of the corruption, also integrity in business and corporate structures, strategic planning of anti-corruption interventions, and assessing the efficiency and other practical issues. Today, within the webinar, we have the regional representative of UNODC, Mr. Dr. Oliver Stolpe, and also Ms. Salma Florence, who is the co-author of the methodological framework, statistical framework. The schedule and the topics for the webinars will be disseminated separately, but for now, we can start with the discussion of the practical issues. Mr. Oliver, the question to you: we face the efficiency of the anti-corruption strategy as an issue very often, and the UNCAC members need to understand the results of the measures taken. But the most interesting part here is that maybe we need to start with understanding of the efficiency. What does it mean? What do you think?
Thank you very much, Azat, and good morning, colleagues. Great pleasure to be back with you, and really glad to see how we're starting to have a certain popularity of these seminars, which we can also tell from the people that are watching the sessions after they have been recorded. Just before maybe answering to that question, I think one really important point that I would also like to make, as Azat already said, I think we are thinking about additional topics beyond those ones that we have already scheduled to be discussed. And in that regard, I think it would be quite useful for us, actually, rather than trying, of course, based on the many conversations that we have with stakeholders in the region about the specific challenges that they're facing in tackling corruption, the innovative maybe tools that they're using, and they would like to learn from others what is their experience with them, and so on and so forth. I think it would be probably even more interesting to really hear from you. So if there are specific topics that you would like us to organize a deep dive on, and of course also to see that we are getting some of our subject matter experts in headquarters to maybe anchor one or the other seminar on a specific topic, from whistleblower protection over conflict of interest, over asset declaration, over mutual legal assistance. Asset recovery was already mentioned. So if you have specific questions that you would like to see discussed, then I would really like to encourage you to do so. But now to come really to your question, Azad, which I think is sort of like at the very core of the evaluation of these various anti-corruption policies, action plans that we see in the region. And it's really super timely because we have just actually two countries that are in the process of launching their new action plans for the period 2025 to 2030 or 2026 to 2030. And they are thinking exactly about this as one of the key topics. And we had an interesting conversation just a few days ago with one of them, and we hope, of course, to discuss with you now in this broader setting as well. Now, the issue that arises is obviously, and my very fundamental question would be actually back to the people that are asking this question. Well, what would you like to measure? How would you define effectiveness, in other words? Do you define effectiveness by the effort that is being put into the endeavor, or by the impact that is being achieved? I mean, it's a little bit like looking at your children, maybe, if you have them, and you look how they're doing in school. And of course, you will definitely acknowledge their effort, but at the end of the day, you will be judging them on the results they bring home to you. And I think it's nothing really much different when we're talking about anti-corruption policies as well. We need to really think about, why are we doing this? And the obvious answer is because we want to reduce the level of corruption and its impact on the social, economic, political development of our respective countries. So then it becomes actually a quite easy answer to it. We want to see less of that corruption. What is maybe a little bit more difficult is then to choose what are good indicators specifically for specific fields. So, for example, for an anti-corruption agency, it might be quite okay to focus really predominantly on the specific actions that they're taking to prevent and counter corruption. But if we're looking then, for example, at individual ministries or sectors of governance, then at that stage, I think we want really to see a lesser of prevalence of corruption as it affects our citizens. So, for example, if we look at the health system, that is in many countries quite affected by issues of petty bribe taking, but it's doctors, nurses, people in the administration. They approach, I guess, in one way or the other, the citizens as they're seeking to access the services, and are soliciting in that context, either explicitly or implicitly, some form of bribery. And then, of course, you have often also that kind of like practices where citizens, maybe after the receipt of the service, feel that some form of extra remuneration, reward is due to the people that have provided the service. But whichever it is, what you probably want to see are less of that kind of practices. And then it becomes, I think, quite straightforward what you want to measure. You want to measure essentially, hopefully, a gradual reduction of these kind of practices as the public, as the citizens are accessing these different type of services. And I think that leads us also to another topic, which is the question, I think, around where do you put your priorities? I would probably like to argue, put your priorities where it affects your citizens the most. There are so many places to fight corruption, obviously. and so many things that should be addressed. But if you would ask me what is probably the most strategic way of going about it, is to go for those kind of services that are accessed in great numbers by the citizens. Health, education, but also police, for example, are typical examples, and I'm sure there are many more, like specific certificates, for example, that people need to have in great numbers. Why is that so? Well, the obvious is clear. That is, of course, where people experience corruption, and therefore it defines in many ways their perception of whether the state is successful in fighting corruption. If you're catching some big fish, that may, of course, make the pages of the newspapers. But if I then, citizen of one of your countries, would go the next day to the school and want to inscribe my 6-year-old, and it is being made clear to me that I need to pay a little bribe in order to get that place in the school where I want to put them, then obviously, even if you lock somebody up and you recover their assets and you establish an example, I will still believe that essentially the system is not yet as clean as I would like it to be. So I think the issue here is really like, if you want to drive change in a visible way for the citizens, and you want to gain and regain and reinstill and enhance their trust in the public sector, and of course in the government's true intention to reduce corruption, then I think that's a good place to start. So in very few words, I would say, do not, where you can, focus on impact, and the counting of activities implemented, laws adopted, workshops conducted, people reached with anti-corruption awareness. These are all just process indicators. They will not give you a true sense of whether what you're doing is actually having an impact. And more importantly, I would say, you fail to create the accountability that you want your anti-corruption action plan to have. Meaning, you want to be sure that the ministries that are, of course, principally responsible for making sure that corruption within their operation is not undermining essentially the access of citizens to different types of services. You want to make sure that they understand that you will be holding them to account for improving the situation by whatever means, not just by ticking boxes in terms of counting how many workshops they have conducted or how many trainings they have conducted. So I think that's how I would, maybe a very lengthy way of answering of how to approach the matter of effectiveness. And yeah, looking forward to discuss a bit further as we go through this seminar. Thanks a lot, Asad.
Thank you so much, Mr. Oliver, for this comprehensive answer. Indeed, the efficiency could be a philosophic issue. What do we understand about efficiency? But anyways, it is always on our agenda, and we will continue to discuss this topic further according to the schedule and the topics. As I've mentioned, we will disseminate the information. If you didn't get the files, you can always find information on the website. And now I would like to hand over to Ms. Salome. Today we are speaking about the illegal enrichment and abuse of power. Ms. Salome, over to you.
Thank you, Asad. Good morning, dear participants. Very happy to come back to this series of webinars. If you remember last time, we were discussing indicators on money laundering. And because the conversation was very interesting, especially the discussion, we were delayed. So we had two topics that we are going to review today. We're gonna review indicators on illicit enrichment and then indicators on abuse of functions. And can I just ask you, Asad, if you can share the presentation? Because I think, yeah, it's with you. Thank you, Safar. In this slide, you can see the suggested indicators on illicit enrichment. This is a topic that is very complicated, but as really all the topics under corruption. But what I'm trying to say is, in terms of indicators in the framework, this UNODC Statistical Framework, we only have 10 indicators. These indicators really show how countries are implementing legal measures, and they are putting procedures in place to really assess the risks related to illicit enrichment. As in other topics, we have different types of indicators. So we have the first one that is a direct measure that is really to measure, let's say, the outcome of the efforts. So indicator A.4.1, it's income declaration. The indicator is the proportion of public officials whose assets cannot be explained. So for actually being able to get this indicator, we need to have a solid and comprehensive legal framework in place in relation to income declaration. We need to have a solid monitoring system. And before the monitoring, actually, we need to have in place a proper system for all public officials to declare their assets and wealth. And only after we have a proper, let's say, modern electronic system to manage income declarations, then we can come up with the proportion of public officials whose assets cannot be explained. This is the first indicator. Then we have, as in other topics, indicators that are under risk, and these are indirect measures, obviously measuring the risks and specifically measuring the efforts by countries to tackle illicit enrichment. So the first one is A.4.2, which is asset and interest disclosure of public officials, existence of accessible and up-to-date registries of database on wealth and assets, so bank accounts and luxury assets. So this is just the existence of these registrations. Then the other indicator that is also a constraint is the existence of a control body to monitor, validate, and enforce asset and interest disclosures by public officials. Then we have the other indicators on the response. This is the legal framework, and Asad is going to detail what is or what should we understand as a comprehensive definition of the financial disclosure regime later on. And finally, we have under response as well indicators, de facto or implementation indicators. And these are all the indicators that we have seen in other topics. This is more about how the criminal justice system is being able or is equipped to really investigate and sanction illicit enrichment. And finally, of course, as in other topics as well, especially on these different types of corruption, we have assets recovered from illicit enrichment, which in this case, I have to say that when preparing for this webinar today, I was reviewing some experiences in some countries, and I know that there are some countries that are really are able to report on these indicators because they have high-profile cases in which former public officials were convicted because of illicit enrichments, and governments were able to recover these assets. And actually, I know there is at least one case in Nigeria, and I hope Oliver can also comment on this one maybe later on. So these are the indicators on illicit enrichment. And I mean, to be fair, all these indicators are only possible to get if there is a comprehensive legal framework around illicit enrichment, and if there are processes in place to actually being able to trace this mismatch between the income of a public official, or what the income of a public official should be based on her or his position, and the actual wealth and assets that this person owns, and that perhaps are from an illicit nature and cannot be explained, and of course are a red flag. So maybe we can start by looking at the indicators in detail. But just to say that it was interesting to hear what Oliver was saying earlier about the kids or your children. When your children go to school, they have to work and they have to come back with their notes by different subjects. Illicit enrichment is a very important subject, and actually these indicators, if they are, let's say, good, if they are complete, if they are transparent, if they are available, they really show the effort from a country to actually tackle corruption. So I would say, I mean, thinking about that analogy, if governments show, let's say, a good mark in illicit enrichment, they are really working hard to show their will to tackle corruption in the public sector. So whenever a country is able to publish this information and it's open to public scrutiny, it's really showing its will, and this may impact in a substantive way the level of trust that citizens may have on the country, but also the level of seriousness, let's say, that can be perceived from outside in relation to the efforts that this country is doing. Because if indicators are there, anybody can review them, can monitor them over time, and can see if they are really this commitment to fight corruption. Now, not all the countries have this kind of comprehensive legal frameworks in place, but they are good examples. Some countries have made significant progress in this regard. In this region, well, not really in this region, but we have seen, for example, that in our neighboring region, Georgia and Ukraine, for example, they have good systems to monitor illicit enrichments, and maybe if anybody's interested, it would be, those two countries would have some good examples of systems in place to actually monitor illicit enrichment. In other regions, I know that Nigeria, Kenya have also solid systems, India, China as well. And in other regions, Argentina and Mexico are good examples as well. In Europe, the ones that, as far as I know, are very good as well are Italy and the Netherlands. But of course, Oliver, you can also comment on that based on your experience in this topic as well. Now, let's try to review these indicators one by one very quickly. So next slide, please. So I think I already described a little bit these indicators. Next one, please. Yeah, so this is the income declaration, proportion of public officials whose assets cannot be explained. I think I already mentioned this. The reason why we should be measuring this is to understand and to spot the discrepancies between the reported income and the actual wealth of public official. In order to be able to get this indicator right, we actually need information, like I said before. We need solid systems to actually have public officials reporting. And well, now we live in a highly technological era. So now creating such systems is not as complicated in the past. But of course, as long as this system for public officials is there and is easy to use, that's already a good progress. And now there must be, of course, some sort of training, some sort of rules, clear rules about when public officials should declare their incomes and assets. And of course, and again, in this part, I think we need to highlight the advantage of having advanced technologies now. Once we have a good system in place, good data, then in this one, we can really try to think about using artificial intelligence and machine learning to actually spot these mismatches between the reported income and actual wealth. But for this, we would also need to actually triangulate information with other sources, and I mean have good coordination with other government bodies and even with public sector potentially. But this is just the idea of at least being serious enough to build these systems in place to be able to monitor this proportion of public officials whose assets cannot be explained. Now, there are challenges as well, not only in terms of legislation and in terms of processes, but also the challenge of underreporting by public officials or potential manipulation. These are also some of the challenges around this indicator. But yeah, it was one of those indicators that most of the countries agreed that would be good to collect and analyze and display. Next one, please. So the next one is asset and interest disclosure of public officials. I already mentioned that this is the existence of an accessible and up-to-date registers or database on bank accounts and luxury assets like real estate and vehicles and other luxury goods. The reasons to measure this is good because it deters corruption by tracing the accumulation of wealth. And it's somehow linked to the other indicator because in the other one we are seeing this mismatch. But in here, it's just the ability of being able to trace it. And like I was saying before, when this information is publicly available, is transparent, then there is an impact in the trust in government by the society in general, and by even the international community, other organizations, investors. I mean, everybody who can really actually access these records can, review them. And also this is extremely useful for investigative journalism. We have seen very interesting cases in other countries that actually come up with good and solid investigations that leads to convictions because of the availability of this kind of information. Again, there are challenges. It's very difficult sometimes to have consistent templates or reporting standards. This is, I mean, easier to do in some countries in comparison to others, but this is one of the challenges. There is, of course, the challenge of having officials not really willing to declare. But again, this is already a red flag, and whoever's in public service should be willing to actually provide this information. And yeah, we also have the challenge of verifying this data. But again, in this era of modern technologies, this is not as difficult as it used to be before. Next one, please. The next one is really about having a good monitoring body that is actually able to review these disclosures and to be able to take it to the next level. So again, it's connected. These bodies should have the authority and the autonomy, and it should be equipped to actually be able to monitor these records and actually disclose them and take them to the chain of the criminal justice system. And I think you changed your screen because we are no longer seeing the PowerPoint. Thank you. And with this one, I will go then to Asad to review the definition of the financial disclosures, which is one of these indicators that are considered de jure. Over to you, Asad.
Thank you, Solomon. The next slide. Indeed, everything what was mentioned by Solomon, as you have noticed, is related to the challenges associated with data collection. And such challenges are faced mainly because of the legal framework, to what extent it allows us to efficiently meet the requirements of the Article 20 of UNCAG. And we need to highlight here that the convention provides a recommendation here. It is related to the fact that transition to the criminalization of the illegal enrichment is not only an article introduced to the criminal code. Actually, it is a set of measures, and in many cases, it requires very serious institutional changes. That is why such transition requires serious efforts, and that is why this is a recommendation. But we also need to mention, as we discussed it before, the UNCAG is a comprehensive tool, and all of the measures proposed by the convention are feasible if they are applied together. So all of the measures are implemented into the national legislation. It is a very important point. When speaking about the illegal enrichment, all of the challenges here will be not only related to the criminalization, but also to the way the definitions are reflected in the criminal code. Also, there are technical elements which may allow you in future have this access to the evidence. Or when speaking about the monitoring of the assets, the investigators and the civil society need to have the opportunity to technically process the publicly available information in short time. For example, the government, for example, covers more than 100,000 people. You can imagine that to adequately assess, measure the data published is a complicated task. So the format in which the declarations are published is also essential, and everything should be well described in the legislation. It's not only timely publishing the declarations, not only the photos or the files, PDF file, for example, it should follow a form of a software and hardware which allows us to process this big data. Only in this case, we will be able to have the bigger picture to understand whether the registration is in compliance with what we have in real situation. If there is a chance for the competent authorities to do the benchmarking, with the social registries, for example, the registry of the property items, movable and movable property. This will also increase the efficiency of the competent authorities. So all of these elements from the technical point of view, in terms of being feasible, given the limited number of people working in the anti-corruption agencies, everything should be taken into account at the de jure level. So we need to understand what to pay attention to when analyzing the legislation. We're speaking about the prosecution, of course, and the technical elements which allow us to make the prosecution realistic. Ms. Salama, handing over back to you.
Thank you, Asad. The next set of indicators, if you remember from the first slide, are all these indicators connected to the criminal justice system. So we had the number of inquiries related to illicit enrichment. Then we had the number of investigations, the number of prosecutions, the number of convictions, then the one on assets recovered from illicit declaration. And the last one was the total number of administrative sanctions, because in some countries, this illicit enrichment has not been yet criminalized, but it is connected with administrative sanctions. So some countries pushed to keep this indicator under illicit enrichment. So these are really all the indicators. Maybe if we go to the next slide, we can finalize this topic of illicit enrichment with some reflections. I don't think this is the right one. I think there is another one in the middle. Yeah, this one. I think these are the reflections of illicit enrichment. We have many reflections there. Maybe it would be good if we just pay attention to two of these very big list. So I think the two main ideas that maybe we can get from all these indicators on illicit enrichments is that this is one of these topics that can really be useful to flag corruption in public officials. And if we have all these indicators available, we can really monitor how income declaration may lead to sanctions and the effective prosecution of some cases, and to the actual punishment of corrupted public officials, and eventually to see if any assets were recovered at some point. As with other topics under this statistical framework, we highly encourage countries to collect these publicly display the information suggested in this statistical framework, because as we have been saying, measuring corruption, or in this case, measuring illicit enrichment, is not only about having one single indicator, but rather having a set of good indicators that can help us to see what is happening, how countries are trying to tackle, first spot and then tackle this kind of behavior in public officials. There are risks, especially in these indicators, because I mentioned manipulation at some point during my previous slides, but the other risk is that all these systems in place can also be used politically, and that's a big risk as well. But of course, again, having these indicators, having the data available and in a transparent way, can also show if the actual information is being used selectively, or in a fair way with the actual commitment to tackle illicit enrichment, to tackle and punish those involved in illicit enrichment. So I would end my reflections on my revision of the indicators under illicit enrichment here. And I think it would be very interesting to hear from Oliver if he can comment from his previous experience on the relevance of these indicators. Over to you, Oliver.
Well, there's a lot to be said. I mean, obviously, these are some key measures. Now, with regard to the illicit enrichment, that is obviously a provision that many countries do not know. They might have similar things on their laws. And in that regard, I think it's also quite important that they understand actually the provisions in their own law. Actually, I just came across, I think it was yesterday or the day before, about some specific provisions in the laws of one of the Central Asian countries. And in the context of, it didn't use exactly the terminology of the UNCAC, but I believe it essentially somewhat seemed to be a mix between illicit enrichment and the trading in influence, another interesting provision of the UNCAC. Both of them, of course, not mandatory. But the whole reason why I'm actually mentioning that is because it's absolutely essential when we're starting to talk about international cooperation that you understand your own law in the context of the specific provisions of the UNCAC, so that you then can address potential issues with regard to dual criminality when you are starting to approach other jurisdictions that may have the provisions of the UNCAC, may be willing to cooperate with you as you're pursuing these, but may not be willing to cooperate with you on provisions that they do not have in their law and that they do not understand in the context. The OECD has a brilliant terminology around that. They call that functional equivalence, meaning essentially, does your law, even if you call it differently, essentially mean the same thing? And the professionals amongst us that are engaged in prosecutorial activities, and in particular, of course, in international cases, for them, it's really absolutely essential to understand these nuances in great detail and to learn of how to present your own law through the lens of the UNCAC to the other side from whom you are seeking cooperation. But now to come to your specific question, well, I mean, just to tap back into the Nigeria example, and as I always was sort of quite, I think, proudly trying to highlight the achievements of Nigeria sort of as a world champion in asset recovery. It is really indeed due to the fact that they have been consistently on this for many, many years. They have been extremely successful in returning billions to Nigeria. They had, of course, their challenges in that context, both in terms of like obtaining recoveries, as well as in terms of reporting recoveries to the public. So that's the side of the indicators. And in terms of then making sure that as they were implementing the recovered funds in their own country, that the standards, so to speak, of transparency and accountability lived up to the expectations of the public, which are very different to the rest, essentially, of the budget. And of course, our colleagues in Uzbekistan that have created the Échange Fund together with the Swiss are very well aware of these challenges. The public feels very different about stolen money or previously stolen money than they feel about everything else. So we need to keep that in mind. That means the scrutiny is much higher. The implicit suspicion that money might be stolen again is there, just simply because of the historic context in which this money is returning to the country. And Nigeria certainly was grappling with these issues at different stages of its otherwise extremely successful asset recovery campaign. There's really a lot that I could say beyond that, but I would, I think, derail the conversation really into topics that I think are maybe for future seminars. So like, I get it back to you, Salome, and I hope I haven't taken us down a rabbit hole. Thanks.
No, thank you. But I think there are a couple of questions in the chat. So maybe Asad, because I think the most important is to have really a dialogue with the participants.
Yes,
so it would be good to take it over to you.
Sure. Oliver, we have a question, and it is about the assessment of efficiency and effectiveness of the strategy. So you noted that the spheres of influence of strategic documents should be determined based on the assessment of population's perception of corruption. In Kazakhstan, this assessment is carried out annually by order of anti-corruption agency by the organization that won the competitive tender, the competition. At the same time, international partners note that the need to conduct an assessment of the level of perception of corruption should be independent. How would you comment this?
This is a great question. Well, first of all, I think it is absolutely brilliant that Kazakhstan is collecting this data. I really want to congratulate you, and I hope this can also inspire other countries in the region to do the same. Now, I just want to be very clear. I think one thing that is really important is when we're talking about perceptions, what I would just like to stress that I'm interested, or I would be interested if I was measuring the impact of anti-corruption strategies, I would be measuring the actual experiences, and I would be very specific in terms of like essentially during the preceding 12 months, have you been in contact with a specific part of the public administration? Yes, no. If so, did you, on how many occasions, give the numbers on any of those indications? Did you get, were you requested a bribe, or were you given the impression that a bribe was required? Did you pay the bribe? How much was it? That kind of data. So very specific, so that we're getting away from essentially this kind of like, do you think your government is corrupt? Which is not an unimportant question, but I think it is a hugely misleading question, and it is very much actually more linked to your general attitude towards government rather than maybe a more objective kind of like indicator. So I think it is very important what you measure before we are getting to the issue of who should be doing the measuring. Now, obviously, it is true, and of course, the more your citizens feel that corruption is still a challenge, the less they might be inclined to immediately believe the government. That is actually one of the reasons why very often we were actually asked by the governments to be joining in those kind of assessments as UNODC. So we lend also a certain level of credibility to it. And of course, I can very, very distinctively say that we were always insisting that, all data is reported, and it's not only reported if it so to speak, fulfills the preconceived aspirations of government in terms of like how successful, for example, efforts have been. So that adds on the credibility side. Of course, you can also find renowned university institutes, I guess, that would to some extent help you to have that credibility. But I also think we should not overstate this issue, because at the end of the day, I think we want to get, of course, all collectively, as we're here, we want to get to a stage where governments really, very rightly so, enjoy the full trust of their citizens. And when government publishes data on all sorts of aspects of its performance, that data in principle is credible. So I think the best is probably some sort of a mixture. But I would not like to have a situation where we are completely taking that data collection out of government. Also, very importantly, because of the sustainability of these kind of efforts, because these kind of like data collections, even with all the modern tools, are very expensive. The other thing is, when we're talking about government performance, I really think that especially now with these kind of like, modern technologies that we have, maybe we can move more and more away from otherwise relatively expensive household survey kind of approaches, which are one-off, give you a very statistically and scientifically solid ground of assessing the status quo, and then of course also measuring potentially the evolution of that status quo. But I would probably move more towards sort of like kind of user questionnaires, shorter questionnaires. People go into a public office, can scan a QR code, get 10 questions, and one of them or a couple of them are also related, essentially, for example, to the issue of corruption, but also there should be questions in general about the user satisfaction with those services. So I think these kind of like approaches would probably give us the big advantage of being able to collect data in a much more timely fashion. So you could immediately compare, for example, different quarters against each other. You would have a continuous feedback mechanism that would hopefully give you a pretty good insight in terms of the prevalence of this issue as it affects your administration. I don't know whether that's helpful. I hope I answered the question.
Great answer. If possible, I would also like to add here, colleagues, there is a saying, there are no independent journalists, because every journalist has a salary and they will always have a chance to criticize someone. I would ask another question or pose it differently. Why do we need the surveys? If the task is just to be in compliance with the criteria of the measurement, this is one point. But if the task is to have regular assessments and measurements and to make them technical, to follow this technical function, to understand the situation, to measure the root causes of the corruption cases, this is another point. And from the scientific point of view, it's very important to ensure the transparency of preparations to perform the survey and the results of the survey. If, as Mr. Oliver mentioned, the database as a result of the investigation is publicly open and anyone could always check, recalculate the data and get the same results, and there will be no questions asked. But we need to be more technical about this. If the task is to inform the anti-corruption policy on one hand and transparent in terms of the preparations and the results. Ms. Solomon, let's continue.
Thank you, Assad. And I think just to add to the previous discussion, I posted the link to the manual for surveys to measure corruption. And of course, this is the gold standard. Many countries have used this manual, not as many as we would like to, but a few countries have used this manual. This is a manual that UNODC published in 2018. And the important issue about this manual is that it describes the methodology to conduct surveys that are solid. And what is more useful is that there are suggested questionnaires. I think Oliver was referring to specific questions to actually get the experience of citizens when dealing with government. And this manual contains sample questionnaires to apply these questionnaires to citizens, or even the one to apply to businesses. And these are very useful questions that you can use at least to start building your own questionnaire, your own survey, because they have important filters to really get the experience of corruption in the best possible way. And I would also like to say that the devil is in the details. So when you are doing these kind of assessments on corruption, even if it's conducted by a government institution, or maybe a government institution in partnership with a university or in partnership with an international organization, it's good to try to do it in the most transparent way. Of course, it helps to have the most solid, professional, experienced government institution doing such things. In some countries, I think it was the case in Nigeria, it was the case in Ghana, in Italy, in Mexico, in Chile. So usually you have the statistical office or the statistical committee, as you know, these bodies in the region, partnering with international organizations like UNODC or others to work together on the questionnaire, to monitor how the information is collected, and of course to come up with the data, to crunch the data and show the results jointly. And that, of course, allows for the scrutiny. If that is allowed, then we can all have some sort of certainty about the validity of the results. So partnerships are important. I mean, if a government institution is going to do such an assessment, maybe a good suggestion is to try to find a partnership with other institutions that can contribute to the validity of the results. And of course, at the end, as Assad was saying, it's important to show the whole documentation. It's important to show the questions and the data for others to see what was the actual result, what the data was saying after doing this kind of exercise. So with this, maybe we'll go very quickly because I think we're running out of time for a change. So the last topic today is abuse of functions. And for this topic, we really have very few indicators. We have 8 indicators, the typical ones on risks, and then we have the legal one, and then we have the de facto or implementation. The first one, 8.5.1, is the mechanisms to assess the risk of corruption in vulnerable positions. Then we have another one on mandatory training, then the one on effective sanctions, and then the typical ones on the criminal justice system and assets recovered. So the ones in blue, and I see you are showing that now, as others are coming from administrative records, which means if the legal framework exists and there are already processes in place, someone maybe have the information about these mechanisms. Maybe someone is collecting information on training. And of course, you have records from the criminal justice system. And so those are the blue ones. And then the one in green comes from the legal framework. So let's go to the first indicator, So this indicator is about mapping those public officials that are exposed or have a higher risk to engage in corruption. I think we can change the next slide. So this is a bit complex because it requires a good mapping of really all the organizational charts of all public institutions. And of course, not all the positions in the public sector are exposed to corruption. The whole idea of these indicators is to actually have countries to do a good mapping of which one of these positions have this risk, are exposed, maybe in some specific sectors. And in these specific sectors, for example, those that are engaged in procurement, or the ones that actually have to run the tenders, or the ones that signed a contract, or maybe even before that, maybe the ones that actually are in charge of drafting the conditions of a public tender. So maybe those are the ones that are more exposed to corruption. So the idea is to assess if there is this mechanism in place to identify those vulnerable positions, and to, based on that, do a monitoring strategy targeting these high-risk positions. Of course, this is also to make sure that there are strategies in place, for example, for rotation, or I don't know, for stopping them for extracting information that is sensitive or that perhaps could give an unfair advantage to anybody outside the organization. And this indicator is really to show that preventive measures are in place. So very good indicator as well, very interesting topic, but of course, a bit challenging to implement in terms of procedures, internal procedures, really. But yeah, I think we can go to the next one. And I think the next one is the one on training. And I have to say, and I think I mentioned this before in the previous webinars, when we were doing the consultations to identify which indicators to include in this statistical framework to measure corruption, we originally didn't include any indicators regarding training, but many countries felt that there is a need to show their efforts in terms of training. We know that indicators related to training are more procedural. They're more like output indicators. The number of trainings that are conducted in a country are not really showing us if there is an impact because of these trainings. They're not really showing us if these are effective, if they are having any effect on the cultural changes or internally or on the behavior of public officials. But even so, countries wanted to include this indicator. So the indicator is mandatory training on abuse of functions, and this is the percentage of public officials that having received mandatory training on integrity and ethics in relation of the total number of public officials by year in the last 12 months, disaggregated by sex. And I guess having this indicator shows some level of effort, again, not so much effectiveness. But of course, having this information might be useful maybe if we triangulate it with all the data that is also connected to prevention efforts. So then with this, we go to the definition of the effective sanctions. Over to you, Wasat.
Thank you, Salome. So, colleagues, as in terms of the previous approaches to assess or measure the legislation, we use the same approach. We analyze the content of the article in the criminal code, and we check whether all of the elements are there, how well they are described. And here I would like to draw your attention to the following. In our countries, we use a very good tool, the anti-corruption screening for the regulatory acts. It's a very powerful tool, and there is some untapped potential still. And this is related to the monitoring of the abuse of power. The anti-corruption screening has a separate set of criteria which should reveal the typical articulations related to the corruption risks and associated with the broad and unlimited distant powers. For example, in the form of the requirement to provide certain documents, let's say 5 of them, and the last point, and others document which the competent authorities think they require to check the reliability. So you can imagine how the public official at the workplace could use this articulation, and also fines, imposing fines from something to something, from $1 to $1,000, let's say, when there is a range. And you can also imagine what does it mean in practice when the inspector, for example, revealed a breach of legislation by the business entity. For example, they didn't meet the hygiene norms, and this articulation is taken from the regulatory framework. We know about the numerous laws and bylaws. This could be tens and hundreds of thousands of such documents. And ultimately, when there is a ground to assume, so such articulations, they might be useful when the law enforcement agencies work, or some supervisory authorities, or the regulators from different sectors, because usually they appeal to the fact that it's not possible to include everything into the legislation. But on another point, we need to understand that everyone should clearly understand what is possible, permissible, or not. So we need to focus on what is prohibited. The less we leave a room for the decision making, especially in the situations when these are not critical issues, the more discretion powers are provided to the least important questions, the bigger chance for the corruption to be developed. So, analyzing the legislation in terms of the methods of the anti-corruption screening of the legal documents, and then you will have a bigger picture of the way the public system works generally. Ms. Salome, over to you.
Thank you, Asad. So as with the other topics, we have the last column on the indicators of response implementation. I won't go into those because there's no point in reviewing. It's this; they are the same than the others: investigations, prosecutions, and convictions. But maybe just to finish this revision of abuse of functions, I would like to highlight 2 ideas. I think these indicators show the ability of identifying risk. We saw the first indicators is about identifying which positions are more exposed to corrupt behavior. I think that's key, and it really shows that countries are more engaged in prevention than in sanctions. It maybe, again, triangulating with other data, it can give us a good understanding of the level of effort that goes to prevent. First with that indicator, and then with the second one on training. And actually, again, by looking at all these indicators, we can understand maybe where to invest more in terms of resources or effort. What I mean by this is, for example, if there's no mechanism in place to map the positions and to flag the risks, maybe we need to invest a bit more on those. If there's not enough training dedicated for ethics and integrity, I mean, again, in relation to the total number of public officials, or in relation to all those officials that are actually holding those positions that have a higher risk to corruption, maybe we need to monitor that. I mean, how many officials have received training on these issues? How many of those officials in high risk positions have received this training? We can have a connection there, maybe about the need of having more training or better training indeed. And also finally, if there are proper legal framework and processes in place to actually monitor abuse of functions. If there's not enough resources or processes in place, then there is a need to invest more on oversight. So just I would leave it there, maybe, and open to answer any questions or have follow up, maybe. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Salome. Colleagues, we are open to receive any questions. We didn't witness any additional questions in the chat box. Once again, we actually are ready to take your questions, even for the entire day. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. No questions, I guess. Okay. Let's finalize for today, not to be late. It's Friday. You have to finalize a lot of things before the working week ends, but you always can share the questions, send them to us. You know the contact details. Bogdan asked for the presentations for the third and the fourth webinar. Please follow our publications on the website, and you can share the email in the chat box, and we will send you the presentations on the previous webinars. The next webinar presentation will be shared after the event. In terms of the questions, you can always approach us, and we would appreciate if you could leave the contact details so we could keep in touch. I will send my email as well if you missed it somehow. Always at your disposal. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Bye-bye. Thank you. See you soon.